Before we dive into Python or React, let's take a look at GraphQL and cover the fundamentals of using it. If you're new to GraphQL, this is the perfect place to start. If you're more familiar with GraphQL and you've used it before, this section will serve as a good refresher. First of all, what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language, and as a query language, it allows us to get data in exactly the way we want. It gives us, as developers, more control over how we use data in our apps. Right now we're looking at a GraphQL IDE or interactive development environment called GraphiQL. It's a tool built into many GraphQL services that allows you to interact with your app data. Right now we're using this tool to interact with a GraphQL API that retrieves Star Wars data from the Star Wars films. You can follow along with me if you head to graphql.org/swappy-GraphQL, and swappy stands for the Star Wars API. So since we can interact with this API using GraphiQL, your first question might be, how do we get data with a GraphQL API? We refer to this process of getting data in GraphQL as querying data with an operation called a query. Let's say we wanted to get a specific piece of data. In particular, we wanted to get the titles of each one of the Star Wars films. So to get this data to query for it, we can write a query in the left-hand side of GraphiQL by opening up a set of curly braces, like so, and then providing the name of the query that will give us the data that we want. So to get data about all the Star Wars films, there's a query provided by the Star Wars API called all films. And you can see all I had to do was type in all, and I had suggested to me the name of the query that we wanted. So these IDEs, such as GraphiQL, give us some IntelliSense that allows us to select a query, and instead of having to type it out, we can just highlight it and hit Tab to expand it. This is really convenient for development. We can't execute this query like this, however. We're getting an error as indicated by this red squiggly line. It's telling us this query or field must have a selection of subfields, and it tells us how to write it even. GraphQL allows us to fine-tune exactly the data that we want. So as compared to a traditional REST API, and there's also a REST version of the Star Wars API, as compared to most APIs that you've likely worked with that are based on routes, you can specify exactly what data you want. So for this RESTful implementation of the Star Wars API, to get data about all the films, we could go to swappy.co/API/films. And this gives us all of the data that it provides about each of the films. It gives us a ton of stuff. The title, the episode ID, all the characters, planets, starships, etc. But what if we just want an individual piece of this data returned to us? In most cases with RESTful APIs, there's no way to specify that. In other words, we get all of a given resource when we request it. This issue of getting more data than what we want is known as overfetching. So GraphQL solves this problem by enabling us to select So in review, we get data with GraphQL through queries, and queries only ask for the data that they need. We ask for the fields of data that we want from a given resource, and the response contains only the data that we requested. This is a big benefit to GraphQL. It eliminates the problem of overfetching, getting more data than what we need. Here we can see the benefit that GraphQL provides to us as developers, especially front-end developers. In the past, we really couldn't choose what properties that we wanted from our backend. We always got the entire resource. With GraphQL, working on the client is much easier because we have complete control over what information is sent. And we only request what we need, no more and no less.